There's a particular kind of silence that comes from being erased in front of a room full of people who don't even know you're missing. I stood at the entrance of a hotel ballroom in downtown Pittsburgh, holding a walnut box I had built with my own 2 hands, while a young woman in a headset told me, apologetically, that my name wasn't anywhere on her list. She checked it 3 times. She was kind about it. Kindness didn't change what the list said. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 71 years old. I taught woodshop at the same high school for 22 years before I retired. My wife Eleanor has been gone 4 years now, and until that evening outside the Ridgeline Hotel, I believed there was nothing in this world I wouldn't do for my only son. Before I tell you what happened inside that hotel, and what happened after, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? I always like knowing who's on the other end of these stories, so drop it in the comments if you don't mind. Now let's get into it, because this one still sits heavy with me, even months later. I had left Altoona before the sun came up that morning. The drive to Pittsburgh isn't a bad one, an hour and 50 minutes if the turnpike behaves itself, but at 71 I don't trust myself on unfamiliar roads once it gets dark, so I gave myself the whole day. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to Eleanor's funeral. She'd bought it for our 38th anniversary, and while she was straightening the collar in front of the hallway mirror, she told me it was a suit that would outlast every important day we had left together. She wasn't wrong about that. I just never pictured one of those days ending with me sitting alone in a parking garage instead of inside the room where my son was getting married. The gift on my passenger seat wasn't fancy. I'd spent 3 weekends in my garage workshop building a keepsake box out of black walnut, the same wood I used to teach my students to work with because it forgives mistakes better than most. Inside, I'd tucked away a stack of Eleanor's recipe cards, the ones in her looping handwriting, because my son's fiancée liked to bake, and Eleanor used to say she hoped those recipes would end up in the hands of grandchildren someday. That box sat unopened on the seat next to me the entire drive home. My son wasn't always a man who could leave his own father standing outside a door. Growing up, Marcus was the kind of boy who'd wave at the school bus window until it turned the corner, just so I'd still be able to see him. When Eleanor got sick, he drove her to every single treatment I couldn't get away from work to take her to. I used to think that meant we'd raised him right. Maybe we had for a while. After trade school, Marcus started a small residential building company he called Kessler & Sons, even though it was only ever him. Business was solid at first. Then materials got expensive, a commercial contract fell apart on him, and by the time he and his fiancée Paige bought their first house out in Bethel Park, money was already tighter than either of them let on. I didn't want him carrying that weight alone, so I quietly stepped in. $24,000 of my retirement savings went toward their down payment. Marcus swore up and down he'd pay it back. I told him not to worry about it and to focus on building something solid. About a year after that, the calls started. He'd sound embarrassed on the other end of the line, telling me business was slow again, that he hated even bringing it up. I never made him ask twice. Eventually, I stopped waiting for the calls altogether and just set up an automatic transfer straight out of my checking account into his mortgage. The first business day of every month, $1,650, rain or shine. Marcus never had to ask again after that. I never brought it up again either. 2 years and 4 months went by that way. 28 payments, one after another, quiet as clockwork. I wasn't a wealthy man. I had my pension from the school district, my Social Security, and whatever Eleanor and I had managed to put away over 38 years of marriage. Every one of those payments meant something else waited. A roof repair got pushed back another season. A vacation Eleanor and I had talked about taking never happened, because by the time I could have gone, she was already too sick to travel, and after that I never had the heart to go alone. I drove the same 15-year-old pickup another winter, then another. I never resented a dollar of it. Helping your own child was never supposed to feel like a debt. At least that's what I told myself. When Marcus finally told me he and Paige were getting married, I was happier than I'd been in years. Eleanor never got to see it. And there's a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly under everything good that happens after someone's gone. But life keeps moving whether your grief is finished or not. The wedding invitation showed up 5 weeks before the ceremony, and something about it felt off from the moment I opened the envelope. No note from Marcus, no handwriting anywhere, just a printed card, no seating information, no rehearsal dinner details, nothing telling me where to be or when. I called him about it. He laughed it off, told me not to worry, told me everything was already handled and all I needed to do was show up. I believed him. I had no reason not to. On the morning of the wedding, I stopped at a florist near the highway and bought a bundle of white roses, Eleanor's favorite, thinking I might set them on a memorial table if the venue had one for family who couldn't be there in person. I never got the chance to find out. I never made it past the ballroom doors. The drive back to Altoona felt a good deal longer than an hour and 50 minutes. About halfway home, I pulled into a rest stop off the turnpike and just sat there with the walnut box open on my lap, running my thumb over Eleanor's handwriting. Neat, patient, the same as always. She used to tell Marcus, back when he was a boy who broke things and needed reminding, that a person's character isn't measured by how they treat people who are watching. It's measured by how they treat the people who'll go on loving them no matter what. Sitting in that rest stop, I wondered whether he'd simply forgotten that, or whether I'd failed somewhere along the way to make sure it stuck. I got home close to midnight. The house looked exactly the way it always did, which somehow made it worse. I hung the suit back in the closet, set the unopened gift on Eleanor's old sewing table, and sat down at my computer. I pulled up my bank account and stared at the scheduled transfer sitting there, first business day of the month, same as it had for 2 years and 4 months. For the first time since I'd set it up, I clicked cancel. A little box popped up asking if I was sure. I didn't hesitate. I clicked yes, shut the computer down, and went to bed knowing my son had no idea his life was about to look very different. I woke up the next morning waiting to feel angry. Instead, I just felt lighter. Not happy, not proud of myself, just lighter. The way you feel when you set down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. I made coffee and sat out on the back porch, watching a pair of cardinals work over Eleanor's old bird feeder. She used to say cardinals showed up when someone was watching over you. I wished she were there to tell me what to make of all this, because I honestly didn't know yet myself. Life kept its shape in the weeks that followed. Mondays I volunteered down at the Habitat for Humanity supply warehouse. Tuesdays I met a few of the old teachers from the district at the Allwine Diner, same booth we'd been sitting in for close to 15 years. Saturdays, when the weather allowed, I'd stop by the VFW post for their fish fry and sit with men who understood what it meant to carry something for decades without ever talking about it. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary retired man's week. The only real difference was that my checking account no longer lost $1,650 at the start of every month, and I hadn't realized how much room that would open up until I actually saw the number sitting there. I finally replaced the water heater that had been leaking since before Eleanor passed. I bought myself a decent recliner after 20 years in the same worn-out chair. Every purchase came with a small stab of guilt I didn't fully understand yet, followed by a second thought that reminded me I hadn't taken anything from anyone. I had simply stopped paying somebody else's bill. Marcus never called. Not to ask if I'd made it home safe after driving almost 2 hours alone in the dark. Not to explain why I'd been standing outside his wedding instead of inside it. Not even to say thank you for a gift he never got the chance to open. I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe the coordinator had made an honest mistake. Maybe Marcus assumed I'd been seated somewhere he just hadn't mentioned. But every day that passed without a word from him made those explanations harder to believe. A man who truly cared would have called within the hour, not let a week go by, then 2. A few weeks in, I stopped by First Keystone Trust to go over some of my retirement accounts with Denise Marsh, who'd managed my banking since before Eleanor got sick. She mentioned almost in passing that my monthly expenses had dropped considerably and asked if I'd finally cancelled that recurring transfer she'd noticed running for a couple of years. I told her it was time. She didn't push for details, the way good bankers rarely do. But she said something before I left that stuck with me the whole drive home. She said sometimes helping a person too long is exactly what keeps them from ever learning to stand on their own. I thought about that the entire way back to Altoona. I thought about how Eleanor had warned me about this very thing years earlier, back when Marcus forgot to pay back a small loan and I laughed it off like it was nothing. She hadn't laughed. She'd told me gently but firmly that helping a child when he falls is one thing, but carrying him after he's already able to walk is another thing entirely. At the time I thought she was being too hard on him. Sitting in that bank parking lot, I wasn't so sure anymore. About 3 weeks after the wedding, I was digging through a kitchen drawer looking for batteries and found an old Father's Day card instead. Marcus couldn't have been more than 12 when he made it. The front said I was the best dad in the world, and inside, in crooked handwriting, he'd written that he wanted to grow up and be just like me. I sat at that kitchen table longer than I care to admit, holding a piece of construction paper a boy made half a lifetime ago. People don't turn into strangers all at once. It happens one small compromise at a time, one excuse stacked on another. until eventually you're standing outside a door that used to always be open to you. Exactly 1 month after the wedding, my phone buzzed while I was pushing a cart through the grocery store. It was a text from Marcus, the first word I'd heard from him since that day. For half a second my heart lifted, thinking maybe this was finally the apology I'd been waiting on. Instead it was 4 words telling me the mortgage was due. No greeting, no mention of the wedding, no question about how I was holding up. Just a reminder, like I was an account he needed to keep current. I stood there in the cereal aisle while other shoppers moved around me, and I felt something settle in me that was calmer than anger. I finished my shopping, drove home, put everything away, fed the birds, made dinner, and only after the dishes were done did I sit down and answer him. I told him plainly and without any bitterness in the wording that I supposed he ought to pay it himself. The phone rang within a minute of me sending that. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, then a third time. By the next morning there were several more texts, each one more panicked than the last, none of them asking how I was doing, all of them circling back to the mortgage. I finally sat down that evening and listened to the one voicemail he'd left. He sounded confused more than anything, convinced there had to be some kind of bank error, wondering out loud why the payment hadn't gone through. Not once did he wonder if his father might have had a reason to stop. Not once did he ask if I was hurt. I deleted the message and sat by the living room window as the sun went down, and it hit me that I hadn't just been paying my son's mortgage for 2 years. I'd been quietly funding the idea that nothing he did would ever catch up with him. Sooner or later, that kind of arrangement always comes due. He showed up at my door that Saturday morning without calling first, which wasn't like him. He looked like he hadn't slept, his collar wrinkled, a few days of stubble on his jaw, the same tired look I remembered wearing myself during the worst nights of Eleanor's illness. I let him in. Nothing in the house had changed. Eleanor's quilt was still draped over the back of the couch. The family photos still lined the hallway. The old grandfather clock still chimed on schedule, and I could tell by the way he looked around that he was noticing all of it for the first time in years. We sat down at the dining room table, and I finally asked him the only question that mattered to me. I wanted to know why I hadn't been at his wedding. He tried the same story about the coordinator making a mistake, and I let him finish before I asked why. If it had truly been a mistake, he never once called afterward to check on me or explain. He didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. When he finally said he was sorry, it came out sounding rehearsed. The kind of apology you give a stranger you bumped into on the sidewalk, not the kind you owe your own father. I asked him plainly whether he was sorry because he'd hurt me, or because the mortgage payment had stopped. He couldn't answer that either, and the silence told me everything I needed to know. The doorbell rang while we were sitting there, and it turned out to be Paige, holding a small bakery box of cinnamon rolls, the kind Eleanor used to bake every Christmas. She'd found out something the day before that she hadn't known the whole time, and she wanted to say it to my face. She'd assumed all along that Marcus's business was covering the mortgage, that the house was secure because he'd built something successful. She hadn't known a single one of those payments had come out of my account. Marcus admitted, sitting right there at that table, that he'd let everyone believe the same thing, even her own parents. For 2 years and 4 months, every first of the month, it had been my bank account quietly carrying that weight while he let the world believe otherwise. I finally asked the question I'd been sitting on since the wedding. I asked who exactly decided I shouldn't be there. Marcus tried to claim no one had decided anything, that it had simply happened. I went to a drawer in my hallway and brought back an envelope I'd been holding on to without telling a soul, not even Gordon, my neighbor. 2 days after the wedding, the coordinator had mailed it to me herself, along with a short note saying she felt I deserved to know it hadn't been an accident. Inside were the final seating chart revisions. My name had been crossed off table 2 with a single word scrawled beside it, removed. Underneath, another name had been added in its place, a member of Paige's extended family. There was also a printed email from Marcus to the coordinator, asking her to make the adjustment they'd already discussed. No confusion, no mix-up. A decision made in writing, days before the wedding. Paige went pale reading it. She asked him directly if he'd swapped his own father out for someone else, and when he tried to explain that Paige's father had helped cover some of the reception costs and he'd wanted more of her family up front, she cut him off, asking how removing his own father was ever supposed to be the solution to that. He didn't have an answer. I told them both, as calmly as I could manage, that the hardest part wasn't missing the wedding itself. It was knowing my seat had existed, and that my own son had chosen to take it away. Paige stood up and walked out to the back porch and stood by Eleanor's old rose bed for a long while. Neither of us went after her. When she came back inside, her eyes were red, and she told us she'd called her mother the night before. Her parents, it turned out, had no idea I hadn't been invited. They'd simply been told I wasn't feeling well and hadn't been able to make the rehearsal dinner, a lie Paige herself had repeated to defend her husband without knowing it was a lie at all. The room went quiet in a way that told me there was more coming. Paige reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of credit card statements she said she'd found by accident while searching for insurance paperwork. Steakhouse charges, resort weekends, designer clothing, a single jewelry store charge for $2,750. Marcus tried to explain some of it away as client entertainment, but the explanations kept running out before the list did. Eventually he admitted quietly that he'd been spending money trying to look successful because he couldn't stand the thought of anyone believing otherwise. Paige asked him, with a kind of exhaustion in her voice I understood completely, whether appearances had mattered more to him than honesty. He didn't answer that one either. Sitting there listening, something clicked into place for me. Marcus had never needed to ask me for more money over the years, because he already knew I'd quietly cover the one expense that mattered most, which left him free to spend whatever he earned trying to look like a man who didn't need help at all. He hadn't set out to be dishonest. He'd gotten addicted to the appearance of success, and without meaning to, I'd been the one financing that addiction the entire time. Marcus finally asked me, with real fear in his voice for the first time all morning, whether I was going to let them lose the house. I told him honestly that I didn't know. I explained that I'd spent 2 years and 4 months preventing consequences from ever reaching him, and maybe it was time consequences finally taught him something I hadn't managed to. He admitted, for the first time that day, that the business wasn't just slow, it was failing. Subcontractors were threatening to sue over unpaid work. The credit cards were nearly maxed. He hadn't told Paige any of it. She sat there absorbing the fact that she'd married a man, and somewhere along the way, married a performance instead. They left together that afternoon, nothing resolved, nothing fixed, but as Marcus reached the front door he stopped and told me again that he was sorry, and this time it sounded like he meant it. I told him I believed he did, but that regret and responsibility were two different things. He asked if there was any way to fix what he'd done. I looked past him toward Eleanor's flower bed and told him that broken trust doesn't get repaired with promises. It gets repaired with choices. He nodded like he understood, and for the first time in a long time, he left my house without asking me for anything at all. A few days later I got a call from a loan officer at First Keystone Trust confirming what I already knew, that the recurring transfer had stopped for good. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the homeowners had reached out on their own asking about a hardship modification. They weren't waiting on me to fix it anymore. They were finally talking to the bank themselves. That was progress, small as it was. I went out that evening with a watering can for Eleanor's roses and realized something standing there in the last light of the day. Love isn't always about giving people exactly what they want. Sometimes it means stepping back far enough that they finally have room to become who they were supposed to be all along. Whatever happened next for Marcus and Paige was going to depend on the two of them, not on me. About 2 weeks passed before I heard from him again, and this time he didn't call or text. He showed up on a rainy Thursday carrying a cardboard box full of things he said he was selling off: watches, golf clubs, a leather briefcase, an espresso machine he'd never once needed. It wasn't going to cover much, he admitted, but he said that wasn't really the point anymore. He told me the bank had agreed to pause foreclosure if he could make 3 consecutive payments on his own. When I asked if he thought he could, he told me honestly that he didn't know yet, and for once that uncertainty gave me more hope than any confident promise would have. Paige called me not long after and asked if I'd meet her for lunch at a small place off Route 51. She told me over iced tea that she'd sold her engagement ring and used the $4,800 to pay down 2 of their credit cards. She said the diamond had never been what made them married in the first place. She told me she understood now that I hadn't been trying to punish anyone, only forcing them to finally face what was real. I told her I wished they'd learned that lesson sooner. So did she. Over the following weeks I heard pieces of the story through mutual friends and through Gordon, who ran into Marcus loading lumber into his own truck bed at the hardware store on Route 88, something he said he'd never once seen my son do with his own hands. Marcus had sold a company truck, cancelled a country club membership I never even knew he'd joined, and started taking on remodeling work himself instead of subcontracting everything out to save money. One Saturday he called and asked for something that wasn't a wedding invitation and wasn't a mortgage payment. He asked for help building an actual budget, something he admitted he'd never once done in 10 years of running a business. We spent 4 hours at my dining room table going through receipts and tax returns, sorting every expense into necessary, optional and waste. The waste pile was disturbing. Unused streaming subscriptions, a leased SUV he barely drove, gym memberships neither of them used. He looked at all of it laid out on the table and admitted he couldn't believe he'd let it get that bad. I told him it hadn't happened overnight. It happened one excuse at a time, same as most things do. Near the end of that afternoon he asked me quietly whether I'd stopped paying the mortgage to hurt him. I told him no, that I'd stopped because I was tired of hurting myself. I explained that every month I solved his problem for him. I'd also been giving him permission never to solve it himself. He sat with that for a long moment before saying he'd never once looked at it that way. A week after that, he asked me to come out to one of his job sites, a modest ranch house in Baldwin, owned by a widow named Mrs. Petrosky. She told me, smiling, that my son had flatly refused to overcharge her for the work, and that he'd told her he'd rather build trust than pad an invoice. Walking back to the truck afterward, I told him that sounded new. He said he'd been thinking about what his mother used to say, about character showing itself in how you treat the people who'll love you regardless. He remembered every word of it. He just admitted he'd forgotten to actually live by it for a while. Before he left my house that evening, he set an envelope on the kitchen table and told me to open it later. Inside was a handwritten letter, not typed, not rushed. He wrote that he'd wondered for weeks why I never once raised my voice at him through any of it, and that he finally understood. The silence had done more than any lecture could have, because it gave him room to hear his own mistakes clearly for the first time. He couldn't undo the wedding, he wrote, and he couldn't give me back what that day should have been. But he promised I'd never again have to wonder where I stood with him. He wanted to earn my trust back, not buy it the way he'd bought everything else. I folded that letter carefully and placed it inside Eleanor's walnut box, alongside her recipe cards. For the first time since that terrible day outside the Ridgeline Hotel, the box finally held something worth keeping. Autumn came on quiet that year, the maples along my street turning the way they always do, and for the first time in a long while I noticed myself looking forward instead of constantly looking back. Healing never happens all at once. It happens one honest conversation at a time, one hard decision, one kept promise stacked on the last. 3 months after the wedding, a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox, no printed lettering, no ribbon, just my name written across the front in my son's own handwriting. Inside was a single card asking if I'd come to dinner on Sunday, letting me know a seat was already waiting for me. I sat at my kitchen table and realized I was smiling before I'd even finished reading it. That Sunday I made the same drive out to Bethel Park. Only this time I wasn't carrying a wedding gift, I was carrying Eleanor's walnut box. Pulling into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was what wasn't there anymore. No leased SUV, no landscaping service signs, just a plain wooden picnic table where an expensive patio set used to sit. The house looked lived in for the first time since they'd bought it. Paige opened the door before I even reached it and pulled me into a hug instead of just smiling politely the way she used to. Inside, the smell of pot roast filled the whole house. The same smell Eleanor used to fill our kitchen with on Sundays, and my 2 grandchildren came barreling into the room shouting for their grandfather before I'd even taken my coat off. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed hearing that word until it hit me all at once. Marcus came in from the kitchen wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with sawdust still on the sleeve, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years, not richer, healthier. He handed me a framed photograph without saying anything at first. It was their wedding portrait, professionally reworked, and standing beside him in it, exactly where I should have been the whole time, was me. He told me he knew it wasn't real, that he couldn't undo what had already happened. But he wanted me to know that was where I'd always belonged. I set the frame down on the table and hugged my son for the first time in longer than I could remember. Neither of us said a word. Sometimes silence is the only thing that says it right. Dinner was simple, pot roast and mashed potatoes and homemade rolls, no caterers, no ballroom, no seating chart to get wrong. Toward the end of the meal, Marcus stood and tapped his glass, and told the whole table, including Paige's parents, that he owed someone an apology. He looked straight at me and said that when he'd planned that wedding, he'd cared more about impressing people than honoring the man who'd spent his whole life taking care of him, and that he'd convinced himself appearances were what mattered, and he'd been wrong. He said the strongest man he knew had driven nearly 2 hours to be there for him, and he'd left him standing outside. Paige's father stood up on his own and crossed the room to shake my hand, admitting he'd wondered where I was that day and should have pushed harder for an answer. There wasn't any bitterness left in me by then, just a quiet sadness for the time none of us would ever get back. Later, sitting on the back porch while the grandkids ran around the yard. Marcus told me the bank had approved their modification and that they'd made every payment themselves since. He said he'd almost asked if I'd start helping again, and then realized that asking would prove he hadn't actually learned anything. I told him he had learned. He said once the house was paid off free and clear, he was taking me on a trip. I told him that was fine, as long as it was round trip, and for a second he looked confused before he burst out laughing, and so did I. It was the first time in a long while we'd laughed together like that. Before I got in my truck to head home, he stopped me in the driveway and told me he used to think success meant owning a bigger house than the next guy. He looked back toward the porch, where Paige and the kids were waving, and said he understood now that success was just having people you love who are still willing to answer the phone when you call. I put a hand on his shoulder and told him not to waste that lesson. He told me he wouldn't. That night, back home in Altoona, I carried the walnut box into the living room and added the new photograph to everything already inside it. Eleanor's recipe cards, Marcus's letter, and now this. Not because it erased what happened, nothing ever fully does, but because it reminded me that forgiveness was never about erasing the past. It's about giving the future a fighting chance. Eleanor used to say families aren't held together by getting everything right. They're held together by humility, by someone finally admitting they were wrong, and by someone else choosing to forgive them for it. Both of those things take more courage than people give them credit for. If there's someone in your own life you've been taking for granted, or someone you've been waiting on to make the first move before you'll forgive them, don't wait for a wedding or a funeral to remind you what actually matters. Tell the people you love that you love them while they're still around to hear it. If this one stayed with you, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Has something like this ever happened in your own family? And if you want more stories about second chances and quiet justice finding its way home, stick around for the next one. Thanks for spending this time with me.